April 6, 1945. Dawn breaks across the waters off Okinawa, painting the horizon in shades of amber and crimson. In a command bunker on Kyushu, the southernmost island of Japan, Vice Admiral Mato Magaki stands before a map covered in pins and marked trajectories. The morning air carries the scent of aviation fuel and cherry blossoms, an incongruous mixture that speaks to the strange duality of this moment. Through the concrete walls, he can hear the engines warming, the Mitsubishi Zeros and Yokosuka bombers preparing for what the Imperial High Command has named Operation Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. 355 aircraft stand ready on the runways. The pilots, most barely 20 years old, have already written their final letters home. Ogaki watches them through the window, young men transformed into weapons, and writes in his diary that flowers of the special attack are falling when the spring is leaving. He does not yet know that within 90 days, he will climb into the back seat of a bomber himself and join them in the sky. He cannot know that what begins this morning will reveal not the divine wind of salvation, but the immeasurable distance between faith and firepower, between spirit and steel. The architects of Operation Kikusui believed they were unleashing salvation wrapped in wings and fuselage. For months, as American forces advanced island by island across the Pacific, Japanese military planners had watched their conventional naval power dissolve. The combined fleet, once the terror of Asian waters, had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike lay scattered across the ocean floor. Trained pilots, cultivated through years of rigorous instruction, had been consumed in the grinder of attrition warfare. By early 1945, Japan's military leadership confronted a mathematics of despair. They possessed neither the fuel, the ships, nor the experienced aviators to wage conventional warfare against the American juggernaut bearing down upon the home islands. In this crucible of strategic desperation, Admiral Takejiro Onishi had crystallized a doctrine that transformed human life into ordnance. The Special Attack Corps was born not from fanaticism alone, but from cold calculation dressed in the language of honor. If one pilot could no longer return from multiple missions, the reasoning went, then one mission should extract absolute maximum value from his sacrifice. Load the aircraft with explosives, strip away the mechanisms of return, aim the weapon at enemy warships, and let the pilot become the guidance system that no American gunner could outmaneuver. The philosophy found fertile ground in a culture already steeped in Bushido codes that venerated self-sacrifice. Young men were told their deaths would save the empire, protect their families, honor their ancestors. They were assured that one Zero packed with explosives and guided by unwavering will could accomplish what conventional bombing runs could not. The calculus seemed compelling. American anti-aircraft fire shot down conventional bombers at alarming rates, often before they could release their payloads. But a kamikaze pilot, diving at terminal velocity, presented a target that kept coming even when hit, guided by human determination until the final instant of impact. Pre-war training programs had emphasized honor, duty, and the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors. Now these concepts were weaponized, channeled into a doctrine that promised tactical results while cloaking strategic bankruptcy in the rhetoric of noble sacrifice. The first kamikaze attacks during the Philippines campaign had achieved shocking success rates, hitting 1 in 3 targets compared to conventional bombing's paltry percentages. This data convinced the admirals that mass deployment would multiply the effect, that overwhelming numbers of suicide aircraft would bleed the American fleet white, make the invasion of Okinawa unsustainable, force negotiations rather than unconditional surrender. So they gathered every aircraft that could fly, every young man who could be convinced or pressured to volunteer. The Navy contributed Zeros, the pride of Japanese aviation now repurposed as manned missiles. The Army offered bombers trainers anything with wings and an engine. By April 1945, Operation Kikusui was prepared to launch 10 massive waves of attacks, each throwing hundreds of aircraft against the American invasion force. The first attack on April 6th would deploy over 500 aircraft, with 355 designated as kamikaze units. The admirals stood in their command centers and saw salvation approaching. They imagined American carriers gutted by flame, battleships listing and sinking, destroyers scattered in disarray. They convinced themselves that spiritual purity would overcome material disadvantage, that Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, would prove mightier than American industry. Vice Admiral Ogaki wrote poetry about the falling cherry blossoms of his special attack pilots. Admiral Onishi spoke of each pilot as a seed that would bloom into victory. They ordered the attacks with the certainty of men who believed divine providence favored the pure of heart. But what the Japanese admirals could not see from their bunkers on Kyushu, what their intelligence services could not adequately convey, what exceeded the capacity of their imaginations to comprehend, was the sheer industrial enormity arrayed against them in the waters off Okinawa. Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force of the United States Navy, represented a concentration of military power unprecedented in human history. 16 aircraft carriers, divided into 4 task groups, cruised in formation east of Okinawa. 7 fleet carriers, each capable of launching 73 aircraft. 6 light carriers contributing their own air wings. Surrounding them, a protective screen of 6 battleships, their massive guns capable of hurling shells the weight of automobiles. 11 cruisers provided additional firepower and anti-aircraft coverage. More than 50 destroyers formed picket lines and radar stations, creating a defensive network that extended beyond the horizon. And above them all, always above them, circled the aircraft that would define this battle and shatter every assumption the Japanese admirals had made. The Vought F-4U Corsair had earned a reputation in the Pacific theater that bordered on mythological. With its distinctive inverted gull wings and massive Pratt & Whitney engine producing over 2,000 horsepower, the Corsair could reach speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and fight longer than any aircraft the Japanese could field. More importantly, it could carry bombs, rockets, and enough ammunition to sustain extended combat patrols. By early 1945, American factories were producing Corsairs and other carrier aircraft at rates that defied comprehension. The industrial base that had been mobilized for total war was now operating at peak efficiency. Boeing factories in Seattle were rolling out B-17 bombers at a rate of 16 per day. Consolidated Aircraft was producing B-24 Liberators even faster. But it was the fighter production that overwhelmed all calculations. Vought Grumman, Chance Vought, and other manufacturers were churning out thousands of fighters monthly. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 military aircraft. By war's end, the total would exceed 300,000 planes. The statistical disparity was so vast it seemed almost abstract. Japan's total wartime production of the Zero, their premier fighter, reached just over 10,000 aircraft across all variants. The United States Navy alone possessed more combat aircraft in the Pacific theater in April 1945 than Japan had built during the entire war. Task Force 58's carriers could launch over 1,000 aircraft. When combined with land-based Marine and Army Air Force squadrons operating from capture islands, the total American air strength in the Okinawa area approached truly overwhelming numbers. The figure of 20,000 aircraft represents not just Task Force 58, but the accumulated aerial might of American forces across the entire Pacific theater by mid-1945. Thousands of Corsairs, Hellcats, Wildcats, Dauntless, and other types filled carrier decks and island airstrips. The production pipeline ensured that losses could be replaced within days. Experienced pilots rotated through training programs that transformed raw recruits into competent aviators in months. The entire system represented industrial warfare at a scale the world had never witnessed. When the Kamikaze pilots took off on the morning of April 6th, they carried with them expectations shaped by propaganda, spiritual training, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what awaited them. These young men, many conscripted from university programs, others volunteers swept up in the fervor of desperate patriotism, had been told they were the decisive weapon. In their final briefings, they were assured that their sacrifice would sink carriers, destroy the invasion fleet, save their homeland. They wrote letters to their families expressing certainty that their deaths would matter, would change the course of the war. One pilot, in his final testament, wrote that he was honored to become a foundation stone of the empire. Another expressed confidence that his spirit would live forever in the glory of Japan. They had been shown photographs of early kamikaze successes, images of American ships burning and listing. They had been told that conventional naval power could not stop a determined pilot willing to guide his aircraft through any defense. The ritual of preparation reinforced these beliefs. White headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans. Ceremonial sake. Photographs taken in front of their aircraft, smiling young men about to achieve immortality. The reality they encountered bore no resemblance to the scenario they had been promised. As the kamikaze formations approached the American fleet, they entered a defensive network of unprecedented sophistication. Radar stations on picket destroyers detected them while still over the horizon, providing early warning that allowed combat air patrol fighters to be vectored to intercept positions. The first kamikazes never saw the American ships. They were intercepted 40 miles out by flights of Corsairs and Hellcats that tore through the Japanese formations with overwhelming speed and firepower. American pilots, benefiting from superior training, better aircraft, and tactical coordination, achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. For every American fighter lost, 10 or more Japanese aircraft fell burning into the sea. Those kamikazes that survived the fighter screen encountered anti-aircraft fire of murderous intensity. 5-inch gun batteries on battleships and cruisers could throw proximity-fused shells that detonated near aircraft, shredding them with shrapnel. 40mm Bofors guns created curtains of explosive rounds. 20mm Oerlikon cannons stitched lines of tracers through the sky. The ships maneuvered in coordinated patterns, concentrating their fire on incoming threats. During the first Kikusui attack on April 6, American forces recorded 355 kamikaze aircraft launched. Task Force 58's Combat Air Patrol shot down 249 Japanese planes before they reached the fleet. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for most of the remainder. Of those 355 kamikazes, only a handful achieved hits on American vessels. The destroyers on picket duty, positioned as early warning stations, absorbed the brunt of successful attacks. These ships, isolated from the main fleet's concentrated firepower, proved vulnerable. Bush and Colquhoun were sunk. Several other destroyers were damaged. But the carriers, the primary targets whose destruction the entire operation aimed to achieve, remained untouched. The massive fleet carriers Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, and Essex continued launching strikes without interruption. The mathematics of attrition worked entirely in America's favor. Japan lost hundreds of aircraft and their irreplaceable pilots in exchange for damaging a handful of destroyers that would be replaced within weeks. What the kamikaze pilots experienced in their final moments was not the glorious success they had been promised, but the crushing realization of inadequacy. Survivors who aborted missions due to mechanical failure, or were shot down but rescued, later described the shock of seeing the American fleet. The horizon filled with ships, more ships than they had believed possible. The sky swarmed with enemy fighters, not the scattered resistance they had been told to expect, but coordinated formations of aircraft superior to anything they flew. Many kamikazes never made it past the outer defensive ring. Those who did found themselves alone, damaged, flying through walls of flak toward targets that seemed impossible to reach. Some turned back, traumatized by the futility. The Japanese military detained these survivors, treating their survival as cowardice or failure. A facility in Fukuoka was used to interrogate kamikaze pilots who had returned without completing their missions. The shame and punishment heaped upon these young men revealed the dark underside of the supposed honor culture that propelled the attacks. They had not volunteered for glory. Many had been compelled by social pressure, unable to refuse without dishonoring their families. Now they face condemnation for surviving an unwinnable mission. The subsequent Kikusui attacks followed the same terrible pattern. Operation Kikusui II on April 12 launched 185 suicide aircraft escorted by 150 fighters. The Americans shot down the majority. Kikusui III, IV, and V unfolded across April and into May, each wave throwing hundreds of aircraft against the American fleet, each resulting in catastrophic Japanese losses. By the end of Operation Kikusui X on June 22, Japan had expended approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties during the Okinawa campaign. The overall success rate hovered between 14 and 19%, meaning that fewer than 1 in 5 kamikazes achieved even a damaging near-miss, much less a direct hit. American records documented 368 ships hit or damaged by kamikazes during the entire Okinawa campaign. Of these, 36 were sunk, mostly destroyers and smaller vessels. Not a single American fleet carrier was lost to kamikaze attack. The vessels that absorbed the most punishment were the radar picket destroyers positioned as early warning stations, isolated from the fleet's concentrated defenses. The human cost to Japan was catastrophic and irreplaceable. Over 4,000 pilots died in kamikaze attacks during Okinawa alone. Each represented years of training, cultural investment, and individual potential annihilated for minimal strategic gain. The American fleet, despite the damage inflicted, continued operations throughout the campaign. Damaged ships retired for repairs and were replaced by vessels arriving from the endless production lines of American shipyards. Carriers that were hit, like Bunker Hill and Enterprise, absorbed tremendous punishment but survived, their damage control teams performing miracles of engineering to keep them functional or return them to combat readiness. The entire American system was designed for sustainability. Pilots who were shot down over water could be rescued by dedicated submarine and seaplane services. Damaged aircraft were replaced from the stream of reinforcements flowing across the Pacific. Even losses that seemed significant were absorbed without diminishing operational capability. For Vice Admiral Agaki, watching from his command post as wave after wave of his pilots departed and did not return, the accumulating data must have painted an increasingly grim picture. His diary entries from this period, later translated and published as Fading Victory, reveal a man caught between ideological commitment and the undeniable evidence of failure. He continued to write poetically about the cherry blossoms falling, about the noble spirit of the special attack, but beneath the rhetoric, the tone shifted toward fatalism. By May, the attacks continued not because they promised victory, but because no alternative existed. The Kamikaze doctrine had become a trap of its own logic. Having committed to the strategy, having expended thousands of lives in its prosecution, to stop would be to admit that those deaths had been meaningless. So the attacks continued, ritual repetitions of a tactic whose strategic bankruptcy became more apparent with each failed wave. The symbolic weight of this disparity extended beyond mere numbers. What Operation Kikusui revealed was the fundamental incompatibility between two modes of warfare, two philosophical approaches to industrial conflict. The Japanese strategy relied on maximizing the value extracted from scarcity. Unable to replace losses, they transformed loss itself into a weapon, making each aircraft's destruction count through deliberate sacrifice. It was warfare shaped by limitation, by the constraints of a resource-poor island nation fighting beyond its industrial capacity. The American approach represented warfare shaped by abundance. Task Force 58 operated on the assumption that losses were inevitable and acceptable provided the system could replace them faster than they occurred. This was warfare as a production problem, where victory belonged to the side that could manufacture, deploy, and sustain superior force over time. The Kamikaze pilot and the Corsair fighter embodied these contrasting philosophies. One was a young man fused with his aircraft in a single-use weapon, his death the fulfillment of his function. The other was a machine, exceptional but replaceable, flown by a pilot trained to survive, complete missions, and return to fly again tomorrow. The Corsair itself became the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy. Its distinctive silhouette, the inverted gull wings that gave it such unmistakable profile, came to represent something larger than a fighter aircraft. To the Japanese pilots who faced them, Corsairs appeared in numbers that seemed impossible. Combat accounts describe the sky darkening with American fighters, formations so large they blotted out the sun. This was not poetic exaggeration, but descriptive accuracy. American carriers routinely launched strikes involving hundreds of aircraft. The coordination required to manage such massive aerial operations was itself a demonstration of organizational and technological sophistication. Radio communications, radar-guided intercepts, coordinated combat air patrols, maintaining overlapping coverage, all represented systemic advantages that individual courage or spiritual commitment could not overcome. Throughout the campaign, American fighter pilots developed tactics specifically for countering kamikaze attacks. They learned to identify the distinctive flight patterns of suicide pilots, the desperate diving approaches that sacrificed maneuverability for speed. Corsair pilots exploited their aircraft's superior performance to position themselves above and behind approaching kamikazes, attacking from angles that gave the suicide pilots no chance to respond. The better-trained American aviators could make multiple gunnery passes, conserving ammunition while maximizing effectiveness. Many kamikazes were shot down by pilots who then proceeded to escort damaged friendly aircraft back to their carriers, demonstrating the sustainability of American operations. The same pilot who stopped a suicide attack in the morning would fly another mission that afternoon, and another the next day, accumulating experience and expertise that continuously improved the defensive network's efficiency. The transformation of perception occurred gradually, but inexorably. In the command bunkers on Kyushu, as intelligence reports filtered back detailing the losses and minimal gains, the admirals confronted a truth they had been psychologically unprepared to accept. Spirit could not defeat industry. Willingness to die could not overcome the capacity to mass produce. The divine wind they had invoked was not blowing in their favor. The very premise of Operation Kikusui, that overwhelming numbers of kamikaze aircraft would break American resolve and force withdrawal, proved fundamentally flawed. The Americans did not withdraw. They did not reduce their operational tempo. If anything, the kamikaze attacks hardened American determination, confirmed the necessity of unconditional surrender, and justified the increasingly devastating conventional and firebombing campaigns against Japanese cities. Each kamikaze that hit an American ship killed sailors and destroyed equipment, but it also reinforced the perception of Japan as a fanatical enemy requiring total defeat. By June, when the organized Kikusui attacks finally ceased, Okinawa had been secured. The island that Japan had defended with such desperation now hosted American airfields. B-29 superfortresses that had been flying from Marianas could now stage through Okinawa, reducing their flight time to targets in Japan. The strategic situation had worsened, not improved. The sacrifice of nearly 2,000 kamikaze pilots during Okinawa had delayed the inevitable by weeks at most. The American fleet remained functional. The invasion of Okinawa succeeded. The path to the Japanese home islands lay open. In the aftermath, Japanese military planners prepared for the next phase, Operation Kikusui, the defense of the home islands, which called for deploying thousands more kamikaze aircraft against an anticipated American invasion. The numbers projected became increasingly fantastical, divorced from reality. Plans called for mobilizing every aircraft in Japan, including trainers and reconnaissance planes, transforming them all into kamikaze weapons. These scenarios assumed that numerical quantity could still achieve what the Okinawa attacks had failed to accomplish, that somehow more of the same would produce different results. The kamikaze campaign at Okinawa represented the high watermark of a tactic that had always been born of desperation rather than strength. It revealed with crystalline clarity that modern industrial warfare rewards sustainability over sacrifice, production over purity of spirit. The 1,900 kamikaze sorties flown during Operation Kikusui sank 36 American ships, mostly destroyers and support vessels, and damaged several hundred more. These were not insignificant casualties. American sailors died in flames, drowned in sinking vessels, lived with horrible burns and trauma. But strategically, tactically, the kamikaze campaign achieved nothing it had promised. It did not stop the invasion of Okinawa. It did not force American withdrawal. It did not preserve the empire. It consumed irreplaceable pilots and aircraft in exchange for replaceable ships and temporary delays. The American fleet that emerged from Okinawa was bruised but intact, and behind it stretched a production pipeline capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. The 20,000 aircraft of American air power, scattered across carriers and island bases throughout the Pacific, represented a force that Japan simply could not match or meaningfully degrade. Task Force 58 alone could absorb losses that would have crippled the entire Japanese naval air arm. The Fast Carrier Task Force at Okinawa was just one component of American military power in the Pacific, which included the strategic bombing campaign devastating Japanese cities, the submarine blockade strangling resource imports, and the ground forces preparing for the ultimate invasion. The kamikaze pilots, courageous or coerced, throwing themselves against this enormous machine, were sacrificed not to save Japan, but to postpone the inevitable recognition of defeat. The pilots who flew on April 6, 1945, and in the waves that followed, deserved better than the fate their admirals assigned them. They deserved strategies that valued their lives, tactics that maximized their skills rather than their deaths, leadership that recognized when a campaign had failed and preserved remaining strength rather than expending it in futile gestures. Instead, they received romanticized language about cherry blossoms and divine winds, empty rhetoric that disguised strategic bankruptcy as spiritual nobility. The young men who wrote final letters to their families, who climbed into cockpits knowing they would not return, carried the weight of impossible expectations and the tragedy of misplaced faith. They believed their sacrifice would matter. The admirals had assured them it would. But the mathematics of industrial warfare, the cold calculus of production and attrition, rendered their courage strategically meaningless. The image of Japanese admirals watching from bunkers as their carefully hoarded aircraft fleet departed on suicide missions, only to face the darkened sky of American air superiority, captures the essential tragedy of the Pacific War's final year. One side fought with the desperation of the doomed, attempting to extract maximum value from scarce resources through sacrifice. The other fought with the confidence of industrial supremacy, able to absorb losses and continue operations without meaningful degradation of capability. The outcome was never in doubt once the initial strategic gambles failed. The Battle of Midway in 1942 had destroyed Japan's carrier striking force, and with it the capability to wage offensive naval warfare. The subsequent island-hopping campaign compressed Japanese defensive perimeters while American production scaled to overwhelming levels. By 1945, Japan was fighting not to win but to survive, hoping that sufficient American casualties might force negotiation rather than annihilation. Operation Kikusui was the embodiment of that desperate hope, the belief that willingness to die could substitute for the means to fight effectively. It could not. The Kamikaze pilots fell like the cherry blossoms Admiral Agaki wrote about, beautiful and tragic and ultimately insignificant against the weight of history. Their deaths bought weeks of delay at the cost of their nation's future, for each lost pilot represented potential that could never be recovered. The American sailors they killed were mourned, honored, and avenged by a nation that could replace the losses and continue the war without pause. The asymmetry was total and devastating. In the end, Operation Kikusui stands as a monument to strategic failure, a case study in the limits of courage divorced from capability. The admirals who conceived it mistook desperation for strategy, sacrifice for strength. They asked their pilots to die for an empire already lost, for a cause rendered hopeless by industrial realities they could not accept. The 600 aircraft that launched into the dawn of April 6th represented not a path to victory, but the final expenditure of a military force consuming itself. And above them, around them, overwhelming them with sheer numerical and technical superiority, the 20,000 aircraft of American air power demonstrated that in modern warfare, spirit alone is not enough. Victory requires production, sustainability, and the cold industrial capacity to manufacture war material faster than it can be destroyed. The sky over Okinawa in April 1945 was not darkened by divine winds or floating chrysanthemums. It was darkened by the silhouettes of Corsairs, Hellcats, and Avengers, by the mass power of an industrial democracy fully mobilized for total war. The Japanese admirals had gambled everything on the hope that American resolve would break before Japanese resources ran out. Instead, they discovered that American resources were functionally inexhaustible, that behind every lost aircraft waited a replacement, behind every damaged ship steamed another fresh from the shipyards, behind every fallen pilot stood a trained replacement. The flowers of the special attack fell and kept falling, and the American fleet sailed on, barely slowed, toward the inevitable conclusion that would arrive 3 months later with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What began on that April morning as a desperate bid for salvation ended as a confirmation of doom. The young men who died in those kamikaze cockpits deserved a better end, a leadership that valued their lives enough to use them wisely rather than expend them in futility. Instead, they became symbols of a deeper failure, a regime that could not distinguish between courage and waste, between sacrifice and murder. Their admirals sent them to die not because it would change the outcome, but because they could conceive no alternative, because the logic of total war and authoritarian honor culture left no space for acknowledgement of defeat. And so the flowers fell wave after wave into an ocean that swallowed them without trace, while the machinery of American industrial power continued its inexorable advance toward Tokyo Bay and the surrender deck of the USS Missouri, where the empire would formally acknowledge what the sky over Okinawa had already proven beyond doubt, that in the contest between faith and firepower, between spirit and steel, between the divine wind and the factory line, the outcome was never truly in question.